Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tailies, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Here, the world slows down for a while. The rain falls softly outside, and we listen to the small moments that often go unnoticed. Memories, letters, thoughts, and dreams. Each story you'll hear tonight is meant to bring calm to your mind and warmth to your heart. So find a cozy spot, let the rain keep you company, and allow your thoughts to drift with the sound. Now, let's begin tonight's story. It was the kind of rain that didn't rush or roar. It arrived like a visitor who had been expected. Soft, gentle, patient. Each drop landed on the roof, like a fingertip tapping a lullaby. And inside the little house tucked beneath the woods, Eliah sat still, listening. The window beside her was fogged slightly at the edges, the warmth from inside meeting the cool hush of the rain. A single lamp glowed beside the window seat, casting soft yellow light across the pages of a closed book, the hem of her blanket, and the soft curls of her hair. She wore a cardigan 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled up just past her knuckles, and she cradled a mug of warm cinnamon tea. The scent curled upward in ribbons of steam, mingling with the earthy freshness of the rain slipping in through the cracked window pane. Somewhere deeper in the house, the wood floor creaked with age, but the world otherwise held its breath. Eliah was 10, small for her age, quiet even among quiet children, and always looking not outward, but inward. She didn't mind the rain. Other kids might have sighed and pressed their noses to windows, longing for sunshine and swings. But Eliah waited for days like this. There was a stillness to rainy days, a kind of hush the world didn't offer when it was sunny. People moved slower. Cars passed with a softer hum. The forest that surrounded her house didn't rustle or clatter, but sighed deeply, like even the trees were grateful for the pause. Eliah reached forward and touched her fingers to the cool glass. Water slid down the pane in rivulets, each one tracing its own quiet path, racing others and merging like stories, meeting in the middle of a page. That's when she heard it, not the tap of rain, not the groan of a branch. Something else, a whisper, not words, at least not in the way grown-ups spoke, but something softer, like a memory being remembered aloud. It came and went with the rhythm of the rain. Only when she stopped thinking, stopped looking, and just listened at first, she thought she imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, or the way water moved across the eaves. But then, the whisper came again, this time slower, a pattern, a murmur, as if the rain itself was trying to say something, but didn't want to wake the house. She held her breath. The sound deepened not louder, just fuller. It carried warmth, sadness, and a kind of knowing that made her heart slow down, the way it did when someone read to her by candlelight or brushed her hair with quiet hands. She closed her eyes. The whisper curled around her, soft as a scarf. It wasn't frightening. It was familiar, like the hush of her mother's voice in the dark before sleep, or the sound of her grandmother stirring tea with a silver spoon in the morning light. Rain slid down the shingles like sighs. Eliah imagined each drop holding a story, maybe stories forgotten by the world, but remembered by the sky. What if, she thought, the rain was the world remembering itself? Her fingers tightened slightly around her mug, now warm rather than hot. She leaned her head gently against the window frame and listened again, this time not just with her ears, but with her whole self. Outside, the forest blurred under gray mist. The leaves didn't shimmer or shake, they rested, catching raindrops like secrets. Birds had gone quiet. Even the wind was shy dot in this soft world. The only sound that mattered was the rain and the whispers it carried. She didn't tell anyone that night. Not her father, who was in his studio downstairs, painting in silence. Not her brother, who was away at school. Not even her cat, Mizo, who curled asleep beside the heater like he'd melted into the floor, Dot. This was her moment. Her secret. Her beginning. Later, as she climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, she left the window cracked open just enough to hear the sound. The rain had shifted into a softer rhythm now, like breathing. Like sleep, Dot, and in that rhythm, the whisper came one last time. Clearer, a name. Eliah. Her eyes opened, but the room was still. The lamp now off, the mug empty, and the rain, a steady hush on the roof, carried her gently into sleep. The next morning, the rain was gone. In its place was a soft mist that clung to the pine trees like a secret refusing to let go. Dew sparkled on the grass, and the roof of Eliah's house steamed faintly as the first light of day touched its shingles. But something had changed. She awoke not to the sound of rain, but to the absence of it, and it felt strange, like waking up and realizing someone who had been sitting beside you had quietly slipped away. Eliah rubbed her eyes and sat up in bed. The window was still slightly open, and cool air drifted in, scented with wet leaves and damp earth. She padded over barefoot, stood on tiptoes, and looked out. Everything glistened. The forest behind the house stood tall and silent, wrapped in silver light. Puddles dotted the garden below like mirrors. Somewhere in the distance, a bird tested its voice, a hesitant note, followed by quiet. But there was no whisper. She waited. Nothing. Maybe it had been a dream, she thought. A soft, comforting dream, brought on by warm tea and rainy weather. But deep inside, she knew better. That night, the rain returned. A gentle tap at first, almost shy. It began during dinner, when Eliah's father was talking about paintbrushes and canvas textures. And she found herself drifting, her ears leaning toward the window more than his words. After dishes were washed and lights dimmed, Eliah tiptoed back to her favorite spot, the window seat tucked beside the bookshelf in the den. She brought her blanket and tea again, this time with a slice of orange floating in the mug. Just like Grandma Lynn used to do. She didn't open the window this time. Instead, she leaned close and rested her cheek against the cool glass. And there it was. The whisper. It didn't come right away. It waited, like someone standing in the doorway, unsure if they were welcome. But when she closed her eyes, stilled her thoughts, and simply listened, it came. Not one voice, many. Soft, gentle, like pages turning, like footsteps on wet stone, like someone breathing through memories. Eliah. It said her name again. She felt something bloom inside her, not fear, but recognition. Like when she stumbled upon an old toy she'd forgotten, or when she heard a melody her mother used to hum in the kitchen. The whisper wasn't just calling her name. It was inviting her, telling her to listen. And so she did. For hours, the rain told her things. Not in clear sentences, not like teachers did, but in feelings, impressions, colors that melted into one another. The whisper spoke of things long gone and things not yet arrived. It painted stories with emotion instead of ink. One whisper sounded like a boy's laughter caught in the branches of a tree. Another felt like a sigh left behind by someone waiting too long at a train station. There was the story of a boat that never came home, and the memory of a lullaby sung by someone who forgot her own name. Eliah didn't always understand, but she always felt something. She began to answer, not out loud, but with her heart. She'd think things like, "I see you," or "I remember," or simply, "I'm here." And the rain, in its gentle way, would seem to nod, or breathe, or carry her thoughts away into the mist. She started noticing more during the day. 2 puddles seemed deeper than they looked. Leaves carried conversations if you were quiet enough. Even the way wind moved through the grass felt like punctuation, marks in a sentence only the rain could finish. She began writing things down. just little notes, words she'd heard or feelings that bloomed during the night. She kept a tiny notebook beside the lamp by her bed. On one page, she wrote, "The rain is not falling. It's returning." Another page simply said, "Some voices don't need mouths. They need water." Her father noticed she was quieter than usual, but he didn't press. He'd always respected silence, the kind that carried weight, not sadness. One evening, he passed by the den and saw her curled up on the window seat, eyes closed, fingers resting lightly on the fogged glass. He didn't interrupt, just paused, then smiled to himself and walked away. Inside, Eliah whispered one word, "Why?" The rain paused then, like a breeze lifting a curtain. The answer came not as a fact, but as a feeling, because some stories need someone to hear them. Eliah opened her eyes. The forest was dark beyond the glass, blurred in falling rain. But inside, in that small room filled with the scent of tea, the warmth of a lamp, and the sound of stories in the rain, she felt something settle inside her chest. A knowing, a beginning. The whispers hadn't chosen her at random. They had been waiting not, and now she was listening. The rain arrived earlier that day, just past lunch. It was quiet at first, then steady like fingers drumming on a tabletop in rhythm with a slow, thoughtful song. The clouds gathered low over the forest, and by the time Eliah reached the den, the world outside had turned a soft silver gray. She was ready. Wrapped in her usual blanket, warm tea nestled between her palms, she settled into the window seat with practiced ease. The moment her head touched the cool glass, the whispers welcomed her back. They didn't start with words. They never did. They began with a feeling, a longing, like someone waiting at the end of a road with no one left to expect. The rain carried it, weaving it into the air, like threads of a story unraveling just for her. That night, the story was about a willow tree. Not just any tree, but one that had stood at the edge of a meadow for over 100 years, its long branches brushing the earth like tired fingers. Its roots were deep and patient, reaching down into the memory of soil. It had seen seasons come and go, lovers meet and part, children grow and forget how to return. The rain told her how the willow had once been young, with bark smooth and limbs eager to stretch toward the sky. Birds built homes in its branches. Bees hovered in its blossoms. And every evening, a little boy would come and sit beneath it, reading stories aloud, believing the tree could listen. And it did. The willow remembered every word. It remembered the boy's laughter, the way his voice would break on sad endings, how he always brought breadcrumbs for the birds and left his shoes in the grass. But boys grow up. One spring, the boy didn't come. Not that day, not the next. And soon, the willow found itself alone. It waded through summers thick with heat, autumns that painted its leaves in gold, winters that pressed frost into its skin. It waited. Through birthdays missed and stories untold, it listened to silence and wind and learned to hold its own sorrow without shaking. The rain that night told Eliah how even trees could feel forgotten, how some memories didn't fade. They just grew quiet, curling deeper into bark, deeper into rings only time could read. Eliah sat perfectly still. She could see the willow in her mind alone in the field, branches swaying not in joy, but in soft remembrance. She could almost hear its thoughts, not angry, not bitter, just waiting. The story lingered. The rain shifted against the window, a change in tempo, like turning a page. Then, one day many years later, the boy, now a man, returned. He had wrinkles beside his eyes and a limp in his step. He didn't carry a book. He didn't bring breadcrumbs. But he did bring silence, and the willow, ever faithful, welcomed it. He sat beneath its branches once more, and for the first time in years, The willow let a single leaf fall into his lap. He looked up Dot and smiled. Eliah let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her fingertips traced the fog on the window pane, drawing slow, curving lines that looked like the willow's branches. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft and steady, as if the world itself were exhaling alongside her. She whispered, "I would have come back." The rain paused for a moment, just a second, and then resumed, as if nodding in quiet agreement. Some stories didn't need endings. They only needed someone to hold them. Eliah opened her notebook and wrote, "The tree waited, not because it hoped, but because it loved." She closed the book gently, set her mug down on the sill, and leaned into the sound of the rain. The story of the willow was still echoing, not in words, but in the warmth behind her ribs. She looked out into the night and made a quiet promise. If the rain ever brought her another story, she would listen. She would remember. She would never let it be forgotten again, because even the oldest trees, the quietest voices, deserved to be heard. Dot. It was a Sunday afternoon when the rain turned from a gentle patter to a deeper hush, like a warm blanket being laid across the world. Eliah stood by the coat rack, slipping on her boots, the scent of wet pine drifting through the open door. Her father was in the kitchen, humming to himself, hands deep in a bowl of dough. He looked up, eyebrow raised. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Eliah nodded. "To Grandma Lynn's?" He didn't stop her. He only wiped his hands and handed her a small paper bag. Inside, 2 sugar biscuits, Grandma's favorite. "Tell her I say hi," he said with a soft smile. The walk to Grandma Lynn's cottage was just 15 minutes through the woods, but today it felt like walking through a memory. The trail was quiet, padded with moss and fallen leaves slick with rain. Every branch seemed to drip with thought. Every puddle mirrored the sky. Grandma Lynn had lived in the same ivy-covered cottage since before Eliah was born. The house had a green roof, cracked windows, and a wind chime made from old spoons and porcelain buttons. Eliah loved it more than any place in the world. When she knocked, the door creaked open slowly, revealing the familiar smell of peppermint, wood smoke, and something older books maybe. Or the past. "Eliah," Grandma Lynn said warmly, her eyes soft as rain. "Come in, little whisper." It was the name she had used since Eliah was small. No one else called her that. Only Grandma. Only on rainy days. Eliah stepped in, boots muddy, cheeks pink from the cold. The cottage was dimly lit, cozy. Mizzo, the cat, had followed her all the way and now slinked in behind, curling up by the hearth like he belonged. The kettle was already on. They didn't talk much. They never had to. Eliah settled into the armchair with the blue quilt, and Grandma poured tea into mismatched cups. Peppermint and lemongrass, with a splash of honey. The scent rose like a quiet hymn. Rain tapped against the roof, as if it were trying to join them. "You've been listening again," Grandma said, not looking up. Eliah nodded slowly. "The whispers are stronger now." "I thought they might be," Grandma replied, setting down her cup. "Rain speaks loudest to those who don't need it to shout." Eliah watched her carefully. Grandma Lynn's hands were old but steady, marked with time and soil and candle wax. Her eyes, though those had never aged. They were the color of river stones and held stories Eliah hadn't yet heard. "Did they talk to you too?" Eliah asked. Grandma nodded. "Still do. Especially here. Especially when it rains." The room was quiet, save for the ticking of an old clock and the whispering outside Dot. Then Grandma stood. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a wooden box, worn smooth at the edges. She placed it on the table between them and opened it slowly. Inside, folded papers, leaves pressed between pages, tiny drawings of clouds and teardrops, and hands held open. These are some of the stories I heard when I was your age, she said. Not all of them, just the ones I didn't want to forget. Eliah reached in gently and pulled out a piece of folded paper. Inside, a note in faded blue ink. The rain remembers the ones we've lost, even when we can't. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Did the rain ever tell you about Mom? She asked quietly. Grandma looked out the window, her eyes tracing the curve of a droplet racing down the glass. All the time, she said. They didn't cry. There was no need. The tears belonged to another time, another version of them. Today, there was only warmth and remembrance, and the sound of rain falling like a story retold. Eliah leaned back in the chair, the cup warming her fingers, and listened out outside. The wind picked up slightly, sending the chimes into a soft clatter. Inside, the two of them sat side by side, not needing to speak to share the same memory. Grandma Lynn reached over and took Eliah's hand. Every drop has a story, she said softly, and the kindest thing we can do is listen. Eliah nodded that night. When she returned home, the rain came with her gently, like a song that followed you from one room to another. She placed the old paper from Grandma's box on her desk, beside her notebook. Then, pulling the covers up under her chin, she closed her eyes to the rhythm of the whispers. They were waiting, and she was ready. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the postman in a yellow raincoat, his boots leaving wet prints on the front steps. Eliah had been watching the rain bead along the edge of the porch railing, lost in thought, when he held it out to her creased, water-streaked, and yellowed with age. There you go, he said with a kind smile. Looks like it's waited a long time to get to you. Eliah turned it over in her hands. There was no return address, just her name, written in familiar looping handwriting, the ink slightly smudged, but still intact. It was her mother's handwriting. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she stood still for a moment, letting the weight of it settle into her palms. The rain tapped softly against the porch roof, steady as a heartbeat. Mizzo wove between her ankles, purring gently, sensing the shift in the air. Back inside, the house was warm and dim. She placed the envelope on the table, beside the teapot and her damp sweater, and stared at it like it might speak first. The rain outside seemed to hush, as if giving space. She lit the lamp by the window. The soft glow spilled across the table, brushing against the envelope's edges, making it look even older, like something found in an attic. Something almost forgotten, but not quite. Then, with careful fingers, Eliah broke the sealed out inside was a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times. The handwriting was the same throughout, gentle, round, full of pauses, as if the person writing had taken deep breaths between every thought. Eliah began to read out, my dearest Eliah. If you are holding this letter, it means time has done what it always does, carry us forward, gently or not. I don't know what age you'll be when this reaches you. I don't know what kind of weather will be waiting outside your window, but I hope with all my heart that it's raining, because rain is how I will come back to you. Her hands trembled slightly. When you were still little, before you could even speak, I would hold you by the window and tell you stories as the rain fell. You didn't understand the words, not yet, but you listened. Your eyes followed each raindrop like it carried meaning. I think you heard something even then, something older than language. There's something I want you to know, something I couldn't stay long enough to say again. I loved you with every part of me, every breath, every hour, every quiet moment by your crib. And even though I may not be there to hold your hand now, I am always close whenever it rains. Eliah blinked, and a tear slid down her cheek, tracing the same path her mother's ink once followed. The world is a noisy place, full of things that try to drown out whispers. But if you ever feel lost or alone, Just find the sound of rain. Sit quietly. Let it speak. It will carry me to you, one drop at a time, Dot. And if you ever hear a voice soft, warm, familiar, that is me, telling you that you are not alone, that you are brave, that you are enough. I'm so proud of you, my little whisper. Love, always, Mom. Eliah folded the letter back, hands trembling. Outside, the rain had deepened. It was not fierce, but full like a lullaby, with words unspoken. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. The whisper came, not just from the window or the roof or the trees outside. It came from within, from someplace that had always been there, waiting. Eliah, it said. You heard me. She didn't respond aloud. She didn't need to. She carried the letter upstairs and placed it gently in the memory jar beside her bed. Among the scraps of paper, drawings, and rain-soaked thoughts she'd collected over the weeks. Then she climbed into bed, pulling the quilt to her chin, and left the window cracked just wide enough for the rain to come through. That night, the whispers didn't tell a new story. They simply repeated one she already knew. I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. And Eliah, listening with her whole heart, whispered back, I know. A few days after the letter arrived, the rain paused. It didn't vanish completely, but hung in the air like a secret waiting to be spoken again. The trees dripped slowly, the sky stayed low, and the wind moved softly through the branches, as if carrying the echo of stories, still unfinished. Eliah felt the quiet dot. It wasn't empty, it was full in a different way, like a breath held, like a room waiting to be entered. She found herself wandering the house, fingertips brushing along banisters and bookshelves, the way her mother used to walk when thinking. Her steps led her to the attic ladder in the hallway, half forgotten, dust-lined and rarely touched dot. She climbed slowly. The attic smelled like cedar and paper and time. Light filtered through a single circular window, catching particles of dust that floated like tiny ghosts. Old trunks, boxes, picture frames, and things wrapped in sheets lay around like sleeping memories. Eliah wasn't looking for anything in particular, but the whispers had grown faint over the last few days, and she missed them, not just the sound, but the presence, the quiet companionship, the way they filled the air like tea steam and lamplight. She needed to feel close to them again. Near the back of the attic, beneath a thick wool blanket and an old winter coat, she found it. An oil lantern. Grass, small, its glass slightly fogged with age. A curl of old wick still clung inside. She turned it over gently in her hands, and on the bottom, scratched in crooked letters, were the initials. Jael, her grandfather, Grandma Lynn, had told her stories about him, how he used to light this lantern and sit under the porch during rainstorms, scribbling in little notebooks and mumbling to himself. He believed the rain carried voices, just as Eliah now did. People had called him strange, a dreamer, but Grandma said he simply listened more deeply than others cared to. Eliah carried the lantern down the attic ladder and into the den. She polished the glass, rewound the wick, and filled the base with fresh oil. Then, as the sky darkened and the hush of rain began once more subtle, like fingertips on skin, she lit the flame. It flickered to life instantly. A soft golden glow filled the room, the kind that seemed to hold memories in its light. The lantern hummed faintly, as if waking from a long sleep. The shadows on the walls stretched and shifted gently, like old friends stretching their limbs after a nap. Eliah sat beside the window and placed the lantern on the sill. The whispers returned. They came softer now, but steadier, like a hand being held, like someone exhaling beside her in a yaw. Dark, and with them came a new story, one she had not asked for, but was ready to receive. The story of the lantern. had once lit the inside of a small cabin deep in the woods, where a boy with tired eyes and gentle hands sat night after night, listening. The boy grew into a man, and the lantern stayed by his side. It glowed during storms. It glowed during silence. It glowed when he wrote letters he never sent, and when he whispered names he no longer spoke aloud. The rain told Eliah how this man, her grandfather, had once written a story in the margins of an old book, a story about a girl who could hear the sky speak. He never finished it. He passed away before he could, but the story remained, carried in raindrops dot held in this very lantern dot as Eliah listened. She imagined her grandfather sitting in this same room, the lantern between them, both wrapped in quiet, both listening not to each other, but to everything beyond. She wondered if he had heard her too, if the stories had passed through time, through him to her, carried by the same breath of rain. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Some lights don't just show the way, they remember it." The rain picked up slightly, pattering against the window in a steady rhythm. The lantern glowed brighter for a moment, then settled again. Eliah rested her head against the glass. She didn't need answers tonight. She only needed the sound of the rain, the hum of the lantern, and the soft weight of knowing she wasn't the first to hear the whispers, and wouldn't be the last dot outside. The forest shimmered beneath the mist. Inside, the flame danced quietly beside her, and above it all, the rain kept speaking old stories, new stories, stories waiting to be heard. Thought it happened on a night when the wind was restless, tossing the rain in all directions like a child scattering marbles across a wooden floor. The trees groaned gently, their wet limbs brushing against one another, and the porch chimes clinked a discordant tune. Eliah was in the kitchen, warming milk on the stove, when she heard the sound. Not the rain, not the wind, a cry, faint, wavering, almost like a question. She turned off the stove and moved toward the door, wrapping a knit shawl around her shoulders. The cry came again clearer this time, not sad, not urgent, just dot 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 alone dot when she opened the door. The rain breathed across her face like a cool sigh, and there, huddled beneath the porch bench, was a small cat. Its fur was soaked through, a dull patchwork of gray and cream, and its eyes blinked slowly, almost apologetically. "Oh," Eliah whispered. "You poor thing." She crouched down, hand outstretched out. The cat didn't flinch. It only stared at her, as if recognizing something. Not fear, not even need, just quiet acknowledgement. It took a single step forward and touched its wet nose to her fingertips. She brought it inside, a towel, a warm corner near the heater. The rest of the milk, now lukewarm and sweet. The cat licked it slowly, then curled up without ceremony and began to purr a soft, rumbling vibration that blended with the hum of the house, the tick of the old clock, the murmur of rain against the windows. She called it Loon, after the moon, not because of its color, but because it seemed to carry the same kind of presence, gentle, watching, always just a little beyond full understanding. That night, with Loon asleep at her feet, Eliah listened. The whispers came slower this time, more like a conversation than a story. They spoke of companionship, of silent comfort, of the way two beings could share space without needing to explain their presence. She asked nothing. The rain responded, anyway, told her about travelers who found one another by accident, about children who whispered secrets to animals who could never repeat them, about how even the loneliest nights could become something softer when shared. Eliah looked down at Loon. The cat had shifted slightly. One paw stretched toward her, eyes half closed, ears twitching faintly with every tap of rain. She wondered where Loon had come from, whose lap it had once curled on, whose windows it had watched from, whose grief it might have absorbed without protest. Cats, she thought, must carry more than just themselves. Maybe that's why they slept so often, because memory is heavy. Over the next few days, Loon stayed, never quite tame, never quite gone. He followed her from room to room, always a few steps behind, never meowing, never asking. Just present Dot when she sat by the window with her tea and her notebook. He'd curl beside her, tail wrapped neatly, head tilted slightly toward the glass, as if he, too, was listening to the rain. Dot, and sometimes, only sometimes, Eliah imagined that the whispers grew clearer when he was near. Not louder, Dot, just sharper, more focused, as if the rain had found another set of ears willing to receive its stories. She began to include him in her notes. The cat hears them, too. I can tell. His ears flick when the stories bend. One evening, during a thunderstorm, the kind that shook the trees and made the walls creak, Loon climbed onto the window seat uninvited. He settled beside her, pressed close, his body warm and solid. The storm outside roared, but inside, all was calm. The lantern flickered beside them, casting golden light across the wet panes and her open notebook. The rain's voice rose and fell, layered with wind and memory. And Eliah listened not just with her heart, but with her whole body. The story that night was short, just one image. A child, sitting beside a pond, whispering secrets into the ear of a stray cat, both of them watching their reflections ripple beneath the falling rain. She didn't need to write it. Down. Dot, she knew it by heart. Felt Lune stirred, blinked up at her, then rested his head against her knee. The rain softened, as if satisfied, as if its story had been safely passed on. Eliah smiled. Sometimes, you don't need to find answers. Dot, sometimes. You just need someone to sit beside you while the sky speaks. The next morning, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle, fine and misty, like breath against glass. The world outside was quiet and wet, and the puddles along the garden path were full and waiting. Eliah stood by the back door, a sheet of paper in her hand. It was pale blue, with faint lines and a small drawing of a bird in the corner. She folded it carefully, crease by crease, into the shape of a tiny boat. Dot. It was something her mother had once taught her, how to fold paper just right so it could float, at least for a little while. The kind of quiet skill passed down like a lullaby, with no beginning and no real need for words. She knelt by the largest puddle in the yard, its surface rippling softly with each drop of rain. The air smelled of wet grass and damp cedar. Trees leaned gently toward the earth. And somewhere in the distance, a crow called out once, then fell silent. Eliah placed the boat on the surface of the water. Dot. It floated. She watched it sway, turn slightly, then drift forward as the rain tapped against its folded sails. In that small motion, there was something bigger than play, something tender, deliberate, like sending a thought out into the world, knowing it may never return the same way. She made another, then another. Dot. Soon, 5 paper boats bobbed in the puddles like small thoughts carried by wind and water. On the inside of each one, she had written a single word: hope. Remember? Soft. Come back. Still. Dot. She didn't plan them. The words had arrived quietly, like the rain, like the whispers that filled the window seat each evening. They were words the rain had taught her, words she now gave back. Loon sat nearby under the bench, tail curled, watching the little boats with solemn eyes. He didn't chase them, didn't move, just observed, as if honoring the quiet ceremony. That evening, Eliah brought the last of the folded boats inside. It was made of thicker paper-soft beige with golden flecks, and on the underside of its sail, she wrote, "Stories float when someone lets them go." She placed it gently on the windowsill, just beside the lantern. The whispers came early that night, not rushed, not loud. Dot. Just curious. Dot. They asked questions not in words, but in wonder, Dot, who will find the boats? What will they carry now? Where do stories go when no one remembers? Eliah answered by lighting the lantern and listening. The rain offered her a story in return. Dot, it was about a boy who lived by the ocean and wrote letters to the sea. He folded them into boats and watched them drift out on the tide, never expecting a reply. Years passed. He grew older. Life changed. But one day, long after he'd forgotten the words he wrote, he found a small boat washed ashore. Inside was a note not in his own hand, but familiar. It said, "I heard you." Eliah felt her chest swell with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite joy. A fullness, a knowing. She opened her notebook. We don't write to be answered. We write so the silence knows it's not alone. Outside, the puddles had begun to overflow, merging with the soil, returning to the earth. The boats would melt by morning. Their stories would seep into roots and stones, disappear into the hush of leaves. But Eliah didn't mind. Stories, she had learned, didn't need to stay. They only needed to be released. That night, she fell asleep with ink on her fingers, the scent of rain in her hair, and the image of tiny boats drifting across the sky. And just before sleep carried her away, she heard the whisper again. Soft, smiling, "We found them." The next morning, Eliah woke to the scent of pine needles and moss. The rain had eased into a fine mist, barely visible but present in the air, like memory. The sky remained soft and pale, a watercolor of grays and whites, and the earth was dark and rich beneath her boots as she stepped into the woods behind the house. She hadn't planned to walk that morning, but something had called to her, something not loud, not urgent, just a pull, a gentle nudge from the edge of sleep that lingered even after she rubbed her eyes and drank the last of the cooled tea on her. Knitstand.lune followed at a distance, hopping gracefully between patches of dry ground and fallen logs. He made no sound, but every so often, Eliah could feel his presence like a shadow she wasn't afraid of. The path was overgrown in places, marked by damp leaves and the quiet hum of insects. Birds rustled in the trees, but didn't sing. The forest, like her, was listening. She took the long trail, the one that curled like a question mark around the hill and dipped into a grove where the trees grew closer together. Light barely reached the ground here. The air held the cool breath of stone and root. And there, nestled beneath an old elm, she found it, a hollow in the trunk, large enough to fit her hand, lined with moss and bits of leaf. Inside, the air smelled like old stories damp, sweet, untouched. She knelt beside it and listened. At first, there was only silence. Then, a whisper. Not the whisper of rain against a window or the hush of wind through pine needles, but a whisper that felt older, lower, a voice that lived in bark and dirt and echoes. It wasn't in words. It was in feeling, warmth, loneliness, laughter folded into time. Eliah leaned closer. Her breath misted the air, and her fingers hovered just above the hollow's edge. The voice told her a story, not one with characters or places, but with sensations. It was the story of a lullaby sung beneath a tree long after the baby had grown up. It was the story of footsteps retraced by someone who couldn't remember why they came. It was the story of a name carved into bark, now unreadable, now moss-covered, but still there. The forest, she realized, remembered things the world did not. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it, the way the roots curled deep into the ground, holding time in silence. The way raindrops slid down leaves and disappeared into the soil, carrying messages with them. The way the wind curved gently around her shoulders like a shawl. She thought of her grandfather's lantern. She thought of her mother's letter. She thought of the paper boats. now softened into pulp beneath puddles. She whispered, "I hear you." The hollow answered, not with sound, but with warmth. A kind of presence that made her feel less like a visitor and more like someone returning home. Gato-Yuen appeared beside her, curling his tail neatly around his paws. He didn't look at her, just sat still and calm, as if this moment belonged to them both. Eliah took a small notebook from her coat pocket, the one she always carried now, and tore a single page from the back. She folded it carefully, placed it into the hollow, and whispered something she didn't say aloud. A promise. The forest would keep it safe. When she stood to leave, the rain began again. Not heavy, just enough to coat the world in silver and bring the scent of life back to the path. She didn't rush down every step, felt like walking through the pages of a book only she could read. When she reached the clearing by the house, she turned once more toward the grove. The trees stood still. The hollow was hidden now by distance and mist, but she felt its voice still humming quietly in her chest. That night, by the window, with the lantern lit and Loon nestled beside her, she wrote, "There are stories that don't want to be found. They want to be remembered." The rain tapped gently on the glass, and the forest, dark and deep and listening, waited quietly to tell its stories again. There was an old glass jar on Eliah's bedside, table-wide mounted, thick, with a tiny crack running from the rim to the base. It had once held honey, the kind her mother used to drizzle into chamomile tea with slow, circling motions. For a long time, it had sat empty, collecting dust and sunlight dot, until one day, Eliah gave it a new purpose. It began with a folded paper. Not big, just a torn piece of notebook. Edges frayed, words barely more than a thought. "I heard laughter in the rain today. It wasn't mine, but it felt like home." She rolled it tightly, tied it with a string, and placed it gently inside the jar. That night, the rain returned steady and rhythmic, and she sat by the window, lantern glowing softly beside her, and listened to the whispers with her whole being. They brought her another story, this one quieter than usual. A memory more than a tale dot. It was the feeling of a birthday candle being blown out. The scent of cake mixed with candle wax. A child's wish not said aloud, just held tightly in the chest. Eliah opened her notebook, wrote just one line. Not all wishes are loud. She folded the paper, tied it, and placed it next to the first dot, and so the memory jar began to fill. Some nights she added one note, sometimes two. On others, just a single dried petal or a pebble found on the forest path, things that held moments like tiny echoes. Things that didn't need to be explained. Lune watched her each night, his tail thudding softly against the blanket. Sometimes he'd nudge the jar with his nose, as if testing its weight. But mostly, he stayed still, quiet, as if guarding the memories inside. The jar became a kind of ritual, not a task, not even a habit, a rhythm, like breathing, like rain. Not one night, when the wind howled harder than usual and thunder grumbled low in the distance. The whispers told her about a girl who had kept her laughter inside for so long. She forgot what it sounded like. She carried a jar too, but hers was full of shadows. Words she never said, feelings she never let out, until one day she dropped the jar, and every unspoken thing fluttered out like moths. They didn't bite, didn't burn, they just flew. And afterward, the girl was lighter. Eliah sat with that story longer than most. She looked at her jar filled now with curls of paper, pressed flowers, tiny pine cones, a button from her mother's old sweater, and wondered what would happen if she ever let it all go. Not because it was too heavy, but because maybe, just maybe, some memories wanted to be wind again. Still, she kept adding to it, not because she feared forgetting, but because she loved remembering. The next morning, When the sun broke briefly through the clouds, she carried the jar outside. She held it up to the light, watching how the papers caught the glow, how shadows of words danced against the glass. She didn't open it. She didn't need to dot. It wasn't about reading what she'd written, Dot. It was about knowing it was there. That night, the whispers didn't come in stories or voices. They came in silence, a kind of hush that wrapped around her shoulders and filled the room like candlelight. Eliah placed the jar back on the table beside the lantern and whispered a thank you, not sure if it was for the rain, for her mother, for her younger self, or simply for the quiet. Then she wrote one more note. Some memories don't fade. They settle and bloom. She tied it gently, placed it in the jar, and turned off the lamp. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady. Inside, the jar gleamed faintly in the dark, holding everything she wasn't ready to let go. The rain that night came slowly, in fragments. It didn't fall in steady rhythms like before. Instead, it arrived in soft pulses, like a heart remembering how to beat after a long silence. Tap, dot, 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 pause, dot, dot. Tap, tap, dot, 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 pause. Eliah lay in bed, covers pulled up to her chin, listening not just for the sound, but for something deeper. Dot. She had been dreaming when it started. A dream without clear images, only the sound of humming. A soft tune, one she couldn't place until she did. Dot. It was a lullaby, not from a songbook, not from school. It was one her mother used to hum when Eliah was very small, before words were important, before sleep came easily. She hadn't heard it in years, hadn't even remembered it existed. But now, in the spaces between raindrops, it came back, a gentle melody, like a rocking chair creaking under a quiet sky. Eliah sat up slowly. The lantern on her bedside table flickered to life with a single strike of the match, and the room filled with its familiar golden glow. Loon stirred at her feet, but didn't lift his head. She reached for her notebook. The rain sang tonight, not to tell a story, just to remind me of something I forgot I loved. She didn't hum along, not yet. The memory was too fragile. Like dew on a leaf, she feared it might vanish if she touched it too soon. Instead, she wrapped herself in her blanket and moved to the window seat. The sky outside was slate-colored, pulsing faintly with distant lightning. The trees swayed in slow motion, and the air shimmered with moisture. Dot. And still beneath it, all that melody. Dot. The rain wasn't whispering words now. It was carrying a tune, one note at a time. Dot. As if her mother's voice had left a trail in the world. And tonight the sky was following it back to her. Eliah closed her eyes. She could almost feel the rhythm of arms rocking her, the scent of lavender and warm milk, the soft warmth of a palm against her forehead. Her mother didn't have a strong singing voice. It was barely a breath when she sang. But Eliah had never needed volume. Dot. Only presence. Dot. And now, years later here, it was again. Dot. In the rain. She let the sound fill her, not just her ears, but the space between her thoughts, the place where sorrow and comfort met without needing to fight. She whispered, I remember. The rain answered with a single roll of thunder, low and distant, like the sky sighing. When she opened her eyes, the window was fogged with breath, and the lantern's reflection danced like a star caught in glass. She took a clean page from her notebook, not to write, just to draw. A single line, curving gently, looping back on itself again and again. A melody. Dot. Her melody. She folded the page and added it to the memory jar. Nestled between a note about the forest and the drawing of a paper boat. Dot. Then she whispered into the night. Not to anyone specific, just to the silence. Sing it again, please. And the rain, gentle and steady, did. That night, as sleep came to carry her away, the lullaby continued not as sound, but as feeling. the kind that wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket, the kind that stayed. Even after the rain was gone, it was during a quiet afternoon, long after the morning's rain had stopped, that Eliah found the old photo album tucked behind the bookshelf. She hadn't been looking for it. In fact, she didn't even know it was there wedged between a forgotten vase and a stack of books with curled pages and sun-faded covers. The album was heavy, wrapped in deep blue linen, the spine frayed at the corners. Dust bloomed in the air as she opened it, floating in shafts of late-day light that came through the window like soft fingers. Most of the photos were ones she remembered. Her mother holding a garden hose and laughing. Her father in the workshop, covered in flecks of paint. Eliah herself as a toddler in a yellow raincoat, stomping joyfully into a puddle. A life caught in stillness, frozen pieces of warmth. But then she turned to a page. She didn't recognize Dot. It held only one photo. A girl standing alone in the rain. She was about Eliah's age, maybe a little older. She wore a plain dress, the fabric damp and clinging to her knees. Her hair was dark, braided loosely over one shoulder. Her feet were bare. She stood in the middle of an empty street, her arms outstretched, head tilted back, eyes closed. And though her mouth didn't smile, her whole body seemed to be listening. Eliah felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not recognition, not something quieter. A pull. There was no caption. No date. No name scrawled on the back dot. She carried the photo to the window, letting the late sunlight brush across the image. The rain had begun again outside, just a whisper, and as it touched the roof and the trees and the glass, the air in the room seemed to change. She heard it almost immediately. A whisper unlike the others, dot slower, dot older. Dot the story that unfolded that evening came in pieces, like the photograph itself silent, soaked in stillness. The girl in the photo had once lived nearby, in a small house with a tin roof and a willow in the yard. She was quiet, much like Eliah, and spent most of her days reading, drawing, or walking barefoot in the garden. But what set her apart was something deeper. She spoke to the rain, not like a child, imagining things, but as if she truly heard it, as if the sky told her stories no one else could hear. Neighbors whispered about her, called her odd, but none of them knew how to listen. Her mother died young. Her father left soon after, and the girl remained, holding on to her garden, her stories, her conversations with the sky. People said she disappeared one day, just vanished, left the town, grew up and moved far away. But others believed she was still there, still listening, still speaking in raindrops. Eliah pressed her fingers gently to the surface of the photograph. Could the whispers travel through time like that? Through paper and ink and silence? Could stories rest in stillness for years, waiting for someone to notice them? She wondered if this girl had once sat where she now sat, hands cupped around tea, eyes closed as the rain carried voices to her window. And more than anything, Eliah wondered if the girl had ever been lonely, that the whispers that night were slow and tender. They told her it was okay to not know everything, that some stories were meant to remain partially untold, held gently like fragile shells, beautiful for their silence. She placed the photograph on her desk, beside the jar and the lantern. Its edges were curled now, softened from years of waiting. Loon, sensing her stillness, leapt up beside her and rested his head on her arm. The room, though unchanged, felt different. Fuller dot, as if someone else had stepped into it. Quietly Eliah added a new note to the jar. Some faces speak louder in silence. Some names aren't written, but remembered. She looked once more at the photograph, about the girl. The rain, the way her arms were open, not in surrender, but in welcome. That night, Eliah dreamed of standing in a street just like that, barefoot, arms wide, the rain singing not to her, but through her. And when she awoke, the photograph still sat by the window, waiting patiently Dot, as if it had always known she'd come. The house was quiet in a different way that morning. There was no whisper of rain against the window, no soft drip from the eaves. The sky was a pale blue, cloudless, bright, unfamiliar. Light filtered in sharply, touching every corner of the room without apology. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Eliah woke to silence not filled by water or wind. She sat up slowly, blinking against the brightness. Lune wasn't by the window as usual. He had curled himself into a tight loaf beneath the armchair, as if unsure what to do without the music of the sky. Eliah stood barefoot on the wooden floor, the boards warm from sunlight. She padded over to the window and looked out. The world was still damp from the night before, but drying quickly. Leaves shimmered with yesterday's memory, but no new droplets fell. The puddles had begun to shrink. The wind was silent. It felt strange, not wrong. Just exposed. Without the rain, there was no cover. No soft wall of sound to lean against. The air felt too open. The trees too still. Her thoughts too loud. She made her tea anyway. The cinnamon felt sharper somehow without the contrast of cool mist. The steam rose fast and disappeared faster. She sat by the window out of habit, notebook in her lap, lantern unlit, and waited. But the whispers didn't come. There was only the occasional chirp of a bird, the rustle of a squirrel in the bushes, the distant sound of a neighbor's door closing. And then, something unexpected happened. She noticed not the stories, but the spaces between them. The room, now filled with golden light, seemed different. The dust in the air danced more visibly. The patterns in the wood grain beneath her feet looked like rivers. The leaves on the trees were more than green. They were 1,000 shades of it. She sipped her tea slowly and listened, not to the rain, but to herself. Inside, beneath the usual noise, was a quiet rhythm, a steady, pulsing presence. Her own breath, her own heart, her own voice. For so long, she had tuned herself to the rain stories. Tonight, she heard her own, and it said, "You are enough, even when the world goes quiet, even when the sky holds its words, even when no whispers come." Stillness, she realized, was not absence. It was a kind of listening too. A different kind of story. Later that day, she wandered outside, bare feet pressing into warm, drying soil. The forest path was dappled with sun. The old hollow in the tree no longer held mist but light. It seemed to glow from within, as if the stories there had folded themselves, neatly and gone to rest. She sat beside it and closed her eyes. No whispers. No wind. Only the sound of a single leaf. Falling. She smiled. Not every day needed to carry a message. Not every hour needed a meaning. Some moments were simply space-breathing room for the soul. That night, she didn't light the lantern. She let the moonlight fill the room. Instead, Lune stretched beside her, content. The memory jar sat undisturbed, no new paper added, and Eliah pulled the blanket to her chin and watched the sky, clear and vast, blinking with stars. She didn't feel forgotten. She didn't feel alone. The rain had taught her how to listen. And now, even in its silence, she heard everything. The world doesn't always speak in water. Sometimes it listens back. She whispered that line to the ceiling before sleep, and the silence around her softened, like a hush wrapping itself gently around her shoulders. And just before dreams came, she thought she felt it again. Not a sound, but a presence. Like the sky had leaned in not to say something, but simply to be near. It was a place Eliah hadn't visited in years. A quiet bench at the edge of the park, where the path curved and dipped toward the small lake. The bench was nothing special wooden, slightly crooked, One leg always sunk a little deeper into the earth than the others. But it was where she'd said goodbye once, not in words, in stillness. She didn't plan to go there that day. But the rain had returned after a long silence, and something about its gentle rhythm pulled her steps toward the place her feet hadn't touched in a very long time. The walk was slow, familiar. Pine needles carpeted the trail, soaked through with fresh rain. Everything glistened in gray light. The wind was low, carrying the scent of earth and water, and Memory.Lune walked behind her in silence, careful to stay out of the deeper puddles. He never rushed, never wandered, just followed, as he always did. When Eliah reached the bench, she stood for a long moment before sitting. The wood was damp, cool beneath her. The lake ahead rippled softly under the drizzle, its surface catching the light like a sheet of silver silk. Reeds swayed, ducks floated near the far end. The world moved slowly here, and so did her thoughts. Dot was on this very bench. She had last sat with someone she loved. A friend, not a loud friendship, not one full of endless laughter or matching bracelets or big moments. It had been a quiet friendship, steady, gentle, like rain. They met often at this bench, sat with their knees barely touching, talking about small things, books, dreams, drawings, fears. Then one day, without warning, her friend moved away. No drama. Just distance. And life went on. But for years after, this bench had stayed in her chest like a small ache. A pause in her memory. Until now. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She had written it weeks ago, not knowing when or where she'd let it go. Some goodbyes are soft. They stay not in what was said, but in what was shared. She read it once more, then tucked it beneath the bench, sliding it gently between the wood and the earth. Not to be found, just to be left. The rain continued to fall, wrapping her in a sound she'd come to know as home. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because the sadness had changed. It had softened, rounded its edges, grown roots instead of wings. She watched the lake, and for a moment, she thought she saw the shape of her old friend sitting beside her again. Barely there, more a memory than a shadow. Not smiling, not speaking, just being, the way they always were. She didn't try to speak to it. She just let it be. The rain tapped against her shoulders, her knees, the bench itself. Each drop a wordless sentence. Each ripple in the lake, a memory stirred. Eventually, Eliah stood. The paper was gone, tucked into the soil. The bench said nothing. The lake, too. But something inside her had changed. Not filled, not emptied. Settled. Une brushed against her leg, urging her home. She gave the bench one last glance, then walked back through the trees, the drizzle trailing her like a soft goodbye. That night, the whispers didn't tell her a story. They simply repeated a single phrase, over and over, like a refrain hummed in a dream. You let it go gently. That is enough. Eliah wrote nothing that night. She needed no paper. Some goodbyes, she realized, live best in the rain. And when she finally fell asleep, it was with the sound of water on leaves, of earth breathing, of a bench waiting by a lake carrying a small piece of her she no longer needed to hold. Eliah sat by the window as evening gathered. The sky outside was a soft curtain of mist and fading light, and the rain was falling again, not in torrents, not even in patterns. Just falling, like it always had, like it always would. But something inside her felt different. It had been weeks, perhaps months, since that first whisper. Since the day the raindrops spoke her name and the stories began to arrive like quiet visitors. She had listened, written, waited, remembered. Now, sitting with the lantern lit and moon curled in a gentle half-moon at her feet, she looked out into the world she thought she knew and saw it anew. She no longer waited for the rain. She carried it with her. The stories were no longer something outside her window. They had moved inward, into the spaces between her thoughts, into the way she looked at puddles, or watched steam rise from a cup, or placed a hand gently on the bark of a tree. The voices hadn't grown louder. She had grown quieter. She had learned to listen in stillness, not to see meaning in things left unsaid. The memory jar beside her was nearly full, now layered with soft paper, pressed leaves, threads of thought and memory, each one a whisper she had held gently before releasing. She had stopped writing them down every night, not because the stories had ended, but because they had begun to weave into her naturally. Every step through the woods, every look toward the clouds, every pause before sleep, the rain no longer spoke to her. It spoke with her. She realized it in small ways, like the way she now hummed the lullaby without thinking, while tying her shoes or pouring tea, or the way she walked slower when the drizzle began, as if sensing someone was speaking, or how she'd started pausing at certain trees, certain puddles, as if they might be old friends. And maybe they were. She thought about her mother's letter, about the willow tree's patience, about the girl in the photograph and the paper boats, and the voice in the hollow trunk. They were all still here, not floating above her in some distant sky, but anchored gently in her chest, in the quiet way of stories that choose not to be forgotten. Eliah stood from the window and walked to the small mirror by her bookshelf. For a moment, she simply looked, not at her face, not at her hair or the shape of her nose. She looked into her own eyes. They were quiet eyes, but deep. She whispered, "Thank you," not to her reflection, but to something deeper, the rain inside her, that part of her that had learned how to wait, how to notice, how to soften without breaking. That night, she took the last page from her notebook. She didn't fold it. She didn't hide it. She wrote. The rain was never just weather. It was memory. It was music. It was me. She left the page on her desk, beside the now silent lantern. Outside, the storm had settled into a lullaby again, steady, tender, like someone brushing fingers through hair. Eliah climbed into bed, pulling the covers around her shoulders. Lou leapt up, settled beside her, and sighed a sound so human, so full of peace. It made her smile. The window was cracked open. As always, the rain whispered, but Eliah didn't need to listen with effort any more. She simply let it flow, through her, within her, and long after her breath had slowed into sleep. The rain continued not to tell a new story, but to hold her gently in the ones she already knew. Outside, the world turned slowly. Inside, everything was still, and somewhere between the hush of the sky and the quiet of her heart, a voice barely louder than a breeze whispered the final line, "You have always belonged here."